first thing we're going to do is have a little anatomy lesson here. Now this is a CCI 250, so a large rifle magnum primer from CCI. And the two primary components that we're addressing in this video is the cup, which is this shiny silver piece down here on the bottom, and the anvil. And the anvil is this brass-colored piece up here on the top. You can see the three prongs there, and there. And that anvil is kind of an interesting little device because it is much harder than the surrounding cup. The cup here is very soft in comparison, and that is by design. Because when the cup is struck by our firing pin there in the middle, it deforms. So the firing pin hits the middle of the cup there in the bottom, and it strikes and pinches the primer pellet between the cup and the anvil. Now, if we look inside this primer, you can see that there's that yellow piece, which is the foil. That's what we call the foil. And just beneath that is the pellet. That's the actual priming compound. Let's take a look at the anvil itself. Well, this is what it would look like. And of course, if we brought a primer in here, the primer would be sitting like this. And the anvil feet here, the anvil prongs, would be pointed down this way. The firing pin would strike here in the center and pinch the pellet between the anvil and the cup. That's that little indentation you see after your firing pin hits the cup in the middle. It gets dented because the pellet gives way and, of course, detonates. These are the two items we're going to be dealing with for the purposes of this video. And if you notice, the anvil sticks up over top of the cup. You can see how the little edge of it right here is protruding above the top of the primer cup. That's what we call anvil protrusion. So the overall height of the primer from the very top of the anvil prongs to the very bottom of the cup is going to be very important for us to conduct all of the testing that we need to and to measure these things effectively. Now that you understand what they are, let's start working with them. Take the prime wear and we'll get the dust cover and dust collar removed and turn it on. Grab the number 1 collar and just check and make sure that we're zeroed. Looks like we're about 1 to 2. Trying to read 1/10,000ths, folks, is pretty hard. But we'll do our level best here to get a repeatable 0. So since we're working with a BRA, I'm going to grab 10 of the CCI 450 primers. And we're going to start measuring our primers. As you can see here, I got my little worksheet out. I like to have a Google Sheet out. And we're going to start measuring these primers. So we'll grab our number 1 collar again. I'm going to grab the stem underneath here. And I'm going to pull that down and create a pocket for me to put this primer in. And measure our overall height. 121.4. So I'm going to grab the stem again, and I'm going to go 121 and 4/10,000ths. Now I'm going to use a razor blade. So I dulled this razor blade and I marked it with black Sharpie on the cutting edge. And I'm going to put that in between the anvil prongs. So in between the prongs, and hold that flat across the top, and that will give us our cup height. So in this case, 113,000ths. So we'll go to cup, 0.113. when I'm done taking that measurement, I'll just release the stem, and the primer sort tray on the prime wire here will catch the primer that I just measured. So we've got the first one measured, and it told us the primer height, the cup height, and from subtracting the cup height from the primer height, we got anvil protrusion of about 8.5 thousandths of anvil protrusion. Now let's just rinse and repeat. Now that we have our primers measured, we can just put them in our primer filler and put them aside. So we're going to be loading them up here at some point. All right, we have here 10 new pieces of Alpha Munitions 6BRA. 10 pieces is not quite as statistically significant as 20 pieces, but you have to start somewhere with your numbers. So you do whatever you feel comfortable with. And we're going to measure the primer pocket depth on these. So I'll grab my number 2 collar, which is the correct collar. So the collars are bolt face specific, so anything in the 308 case head cartridge family will work in here. And I'm going to measure a primer pocket depth. Looks like we have 120 thousandths deep, and we're repeating to within 2 or 3 10,000ths. I'm going to call that 120 and 7 10,000ths. Okay, now I've got all the data that I'm going to need to start tuning my ignition. So this is kind of obvious. I have the primers listed here, and this is the overall height of the primer. So I type in the height, and that gives me the tallest primer in the max field and the shortest primer in the minimum. And then I'm getting an ES here of, so that's just a subtraction of these two. So the extreme spread of the shortest and tallest. It looks like here we have a very consistent batch of primers because not even 2 thousandths of variance amongst the batch here. This is what we're looking for in a really good batch of primers. It looks like our tallest cup was 113 thousandths, and our shallowest one was 111 thousandths. So the extreme spread there is pretty good too, but we do have some variance. So that tells us our anvil protrusion. So if we subtract the cup height from the primer overall height, we get our anvil protrusion numbers here, and they were pretty good. Same thing, we got about just shy of 3 thousandths. Our primer pocket depths are in the final column, and we've got 1.5 thousandths of variance amongst that batch of Alpha Munitions brass. This column here is when we can start actually acting on this data. Now, the first number is essentially anvil contact. So it says thousandths below flush for anvil contact. Now, what we're doing here is taking the deepest pocket, which was 122 thousandths and 1 10,000th, and we're subtracting our shortest primer, so our minimum. That gives us our 1.5 thousandths. That's just contact. We want better than that. So contact is 1.5 thousandths beneath flush, but I'm going to put 2 thousandths of forgiveness in there. So what if we had a primer that was 2 thousandths shorter, or a pocket that is 2 thousandths deeper, or more commonly, a compound error with another thousandths shallower here and another thousandths deeper over here. So I'm essentially buying some forgiveness here, and I'm going to say that I want 2 thousandths of forgiveness. So that means if I go 3.5 thousandths beneath flush, then I've got contact plus a couple of thousandths of anvil crush on these. And so that's a good place. You can see here it says thousandths below flush for reliable ignition. So this is the minimum starting place where you should be if you're not shooting a primer seeding depth test. If you wanted to just start with consistent, reliable ignition, then this is the math on how you do that. So I'm subtracting my shortest primer from my deepest pocket, and then I'm adding 0.02 to that number, and I come up with this here for this batch of components. Well, why is this so important? Why do we want the deepest pocket and the shortest primer? The reason why is it presents the worst case scenario for priming. Because if we don't get the primer into the pocket enough, the anvil will not touch the bottom of the pocket. So those 3 little prongs that are sticking up will not touch the bottom of the pocket that's in the brass. If that happens, when the firing pin hits the primer cup, it can shove the anvil forward instead of the anvil staying in place. The whole job for the anvil here is that it's supposed to stay static. It's supposed to resist the movement. The compound that makes this pellet up requires a couple of preconditions in order to explode. So the first one is it needs to be compressed. And the second one is it needs an impact velocity. Now the compression is mostly just to help the impact velocity build, but essentially it is an impact-sensitive explosive. Now just to emphasize this point on there needing to be an impact velocity, here I am crushing a primer. This is a CCI 450, and I'm put it in the jaws of this vise here, and I am crushing it slowly. And this should illustrate to you all that the impact velocity is a required element. So if we don't have a impact velocity, the primer will not actually detonate. So when I put it in the vise jaws here and I crush it very slowly, nothing happens. It doesn't detonate. And you can see the amount of force that I put on this thing was sufficient to tear the cup. You can actually see the material in the cup. And this is a silver plating or some kind of a plating that's on the outside of them. But the actual material is a type of brass alloy, I believe, that makes up the cup. And folks, if I can't get one of these primers to detonate by crushing it with a vise like this, you can believe that it needs impact velocity. And so the impact velocity consistency is also important and makes this primer do what it's supposed to do. So the anvil prongs need to be at the bottom of the pocket to make sure that they don't move when the firing pin starts pressing on that primer cup and pinching the pellet between the cup and the anvil. So the very top part of the anvil that we saw earlier, that needs to stay in place. So in order to have reliable ignition, we must have those prongs seated firmly against the bottom of our primer pocket. As long as those prongs are firmly seated against the bottom, then when the firing pin hits it, the pellet will have nowhere to go and the primer will not be moving. Instead, the cup will deform and it will pinch that compound between there like it's supposed to, and we will have an ignition. As you may have noticed by the data that we've collected so far, when we're talking about primers and the components, so the primer pocket depth in the brass, the cup height or the overall height of the primer, and the subsequent anvil protrusion, we're talking about very small numbers here. It's very hard to illustrate just how small of a number we're dealing with here, but a typical hair off your head is going to be somewhere between 2 and 4 thousandths thick, and that is so infinitesimally small. I would challenge you, take your calipers and open the jaws up until you get 2 thousandths or something, and then try to look through those jaws. You can even do it in front of a bright light source. You'll see that it is just this tiniest little crack, almost imperceptible to the human eye without some kind of magnification. Now, that is why I invented the PrimeWare and was granted a patent on this device. The infinitesimally small measurements that we have to take here, there's very few metrology tools out there that are up to the task of getting these measurements and all of them that we need in order to actually have a working methodology. So the methodology that I've created that allows us to take these numbers that we get from the PrimeWare when we're measuring our components and use them to get a better real-world result. The numbers are so small that we can't use a drop indicator of cheap Chinese manufacturer, and we certainly can't use one that doesn't resolve down to at least 1/10,000th. Now, in the machining world, it's long been held, and this is a philosophy that I agree with, that if you're trying to measure something and hold a specific tolerance, well, you need a metrology tool, a measuring tool that is at least one order of magnitude greater in its capabilities, so its resolution that it can measure to, at least one order of magnitude greater than the tolerance that you're trying to hold. So if we're trying to hold 1,000th, so plus or minus half of a thousandth, then we would need a tool that is at least 10 times greater than that resolution. So if we want to hold a thousandth effectively, we need a measuring tool that can read at least 1/10,000th. So the indicator that we use here on the PrimeWare is made by CDI, and that's Chicago Dial Indicator. They're one of the very best drop indicator manufacturers on Earth. Folks, it will read out that 1/10,000th of an inch, not 0.0005, which would be half of a thousandth. This unit will resolve down to a singular 10,000th of an inch. When we're dealing with measurements that are so very small, you can see that the variances that we're talking about here in the primer heights and anvil protrusion and pocket depths, we're dealing with numbers that are consistently beneath 10,000ths, and oftentimes we're dealing with a variance of 2,000ths or maybe 2,500ths or something like that. So if we're going to make any meaningful decisions about primer seating depth or the ignition, how that is going to work when we load that ammunition, then we need a tool that can read out very accurately and precisely. And the PrimeWare is the only tool of its kind that can do this. And as I said, it is a patented tool. Our PrimeWare stand holds the tool at a nice angle to allow you to get on top and take your measurement and very plainly see the display that's on there. And if you want to, if you'd like to even have a better view, you can always use the app. You can download the electronic dial indicator app from your phone's app store or your tablet's app store, and you can link it up via Bluetooth to this indicator and get a much larger display. And you can also have some data logging capabilities that you can use when doing so. Though I'm a fan of just collecting my own data manually, so I'll read the display and then type it into my Google Sheet that I have doing all the calculations for me to get the numbers that I like here. As long as you operate within these rules of measurement, you'll have good and reliable ignition. This reliable ignition will ensure that you will not have a failure to fire that is ignition related, at least as so far as the ammo is concerned. Now, if you have an inconsistent ignition in your rifle, so if your action has not been timed and tuned, meaning the firing pin is not moving the same way for each cycle, and it maybe doesn't have enough energy that it's hitting the primer with, well, then there's all kinds of things that you can have in your rifle that will cause all kinds of unreliable ignition. This is a very critical element to making sure that you have a consistent ignition. I've been running tuned ignition systems in my rifles for about the past 7 years, and I used to just do it myself. The smith that I worked with at the time didn't do any action tuning, and so it's something that I would do, and I would just go through there and polish up everything, and I would have to machine off a couple of engagement surfaces or stone them off to get the correct dimensions that I needed everywhere. So this ignition is super important. And the work that we do to evaluate our components, our reloading components, our brass and our primers, the exact lot numbers of those that we're going to be using, and we do that every subsequent firing. The work that we do to evaluate these things sets us up for success in the same way that the work that we do with any of our brass or any of our other things that we do in this discipline does. It's just another variable that many of you are not controlling, that were you to control it, you'd be able to rein in those performances. You'd be able to eliminate some flyers. You'd be able to shrink your string spreads and standard deviations. You would just have an altogether better relationship with your ecosystem. So by using our competition primer seeder and the PrimeWare digital, you have access to an ecosystem and a certainty of priming your cases that no other system anywhere can provide. Now, if you look down at the bottom of my spreadsheet here, you can see this spot that says Primer Seeding Depth Test Window. Now, this is where we're putting that column where we track our anvil protrusion to work. Now, what I'm looking for here is a amount of adjustment that I can make while shooting a primer seeding depth test, a live fire seeding test of our primers. We used the above numbers to get to the point where we have reliable ignition. But I know from the anvil protrusion that I have here that I have about 13 thousandths of window in these exact components. Now, if we do the math based on the numbers you guys see, it doesn't really check out because I have added 2 thousandths of forgiveness into our measurement here. So if I'm going to conduct a primer seeding depth test, I don't want to go very much past contact of the cup with the bottom of the pocket. Now let's talk about anvil crush for a second. We already established that if we use the above numbers and we add 2 thousandths of forgiveness in that number, we're not actually going to be just going until we have contact. So we're going to seat the primer deep until we have contact with the bottom of the pocket. Then we're going to seat it even further. So that farther measurement there means that we're going to compress. So the anvil hitting the bottom of the pocket, and we're pushing on that bottom of the cup. Well, we're going to push past contact, and we're going to start moving the anvil into the cup, and we're going to compress that anvil. And actually, it'd be more fitting if we said that we're going to compress the pellet, or if we were going to compress the cup, because that anvil, once those prongs hit the bottom, it's not going anywhere. Now, there's a bunch of variables that we have to consider here, and a lot of them are not surface level stuff. For instance, we've got those 3 prongs that are sitting there on the bottom of our anvil. Well, what if the anvil is tilted like this, and only 2 of the prongs are making contact with the bottom of the pocket? Well, if we add a little bit of crush, it might straighten that out. It might make it so that all 3 are touching, and that is optimal. That's what we want. We want all 3 of the anvil prongs to firmly be seated against the bottom of the pocket. But then, as we move the anvil into the pocket, there's oftentimes a smaller area of the primer pocket as we get deeper into the pocket. So the pockets are not perfectly straight up and down. Often as we reach toward the bottom of the primer pocket, the diameter of the pocket will shrink a little bit. And then as we get beneath that, there'll be a radius in the bottom of the pocket. And so as we move that primer in there, the constriction of the primer pocket will be pinching. It'll be pushing on the side of the primer itself, particularly the cup. Well, in that instance, the primer cup is getting pinched in between the anvil prongs and the primer pocket wall. And as we apply that pinch, the primer cup isn't going to want to slide very easily along those prongs anymore. So if we go to insert our primer and we don't account for this, we could non-uniformly deform our primer cup. So this is where insertion velocity comes into the discussion. So we've got this relatively squishy object, our primer, going into a decidedly stiffer object, our primer pocket, right? The head of our brass is much stronger and is very much resisting deformation in a much greater way than our primer, which the primer cup is designed to deform in some capacity. It must deform in order to do its job. So there is a friction load both between the primer cup and the primer pocket wall. And the primer cup on the OD and the primer pocket wall on the ID, those two things are moving past each other. So we've got a friction load there. Then, if the anvil prongs come to reach the bottom of the pocket, and they may deform the material just a little bit on the very base of the primer pocket there, mostly they're just going to start orienting themselves and get flattened out on the bottom of the pocket. Well, when the anvil comes to stop there, and we keep pushing on the primer tool, well, then the cup has an opportunity to push and keep going up into the primer pocket. Then we have a friction between the anvil and the cup. So now we're talking about the ID, the inner diameter of the primer cup, and the OD, or the contact points on the outside of the anvil prongs. Now, these contact points are relatively minimal compared to the contact points on the outside of the cup. Obviously, the entire perimeter of the primer cup is in contact with the primer pocket wall. Well, as long as everything is correct here. So as we insert the primer, there's a lot of friction between these interfaces that's taking place. If we do it too slow, there won't be any velocity to overcome that friction. And we can have a much greater friction differential from one side of the primer to the other. And that can make things get all out of shape. The other thing is that if we are going too slow, the friction is going to be very much greater. If we go fast, well, then we can use that velocity, the insertion velocity of this primer, to overcome the friction load. Because once all of this happens, all of this goes into the primer pocket and it comes to a stop. And as soon as any of these objects stop moving, the friction differential becomes insurmountable. It will not be able to start moving again unless you moved it way more than you can. Now, what I mean by that is once they've come to a stop, you'd have to move them like 10 or 20 thousandths or something to break that contact and get them gliding past each other again. And that's just very unlikely because once we stop, we don't have that much room to go anymore. We just have a few thousandths to work with. We don't have 10, 20 thousandths to work with. Now, I want to heavily accent this for you out there. You have one chance to get these primers into this pocket in the correct manner. And that's the first chance, your first time. When you push this primer in there, as soon as it stops, it's not like you can adjust your priming tool deeper and push it in a little deeper and fix it. That is not happening. The reason it's not happening is the aforementioned constriction, the constriction in the bottom of these pockets. Even if it's not there, because some of you think it's a good idea to use a primer pocket uniforming tool on your brass, which almost universally is not a good idea. Even if you thought you removed that constriction, the constriction is going to come back as you put firings on this brass. And so then you would need to uniform it every time. And with the kinds of uniforming tools that are out there, there's no actual uniforming taking place. And I want to be very clear about that. I do not agree with any of the uniforming tools that are currently out there in any form that I have seen. They cannot be used reliably enough. They generally create a non-uniformity, and they break the uniformity that we have during the seating element of these primers. So it's just a bad idea all around. Don't do it. There's not a reason to do it as long as you're using high quality brass. And we actually want this constriction to be here. We don't want it to be gone. So even if we could have a perfect primer pocket uniforming tool, I wouldn't like using it because I want the constriction to lock this primer in place once I've set it. I don't want it working its way back out again. And if we don't have the proper amount of force pinching that cup and clamping it essentially between the primer pocket wall and our anvil, so it's pinching that cup in there like that, it's very common for the primers to start walking out over time. This is one of the number one effects that I see from guys that use these primer pocket uniformers is their ignition is all over the place. I mean, they don't realize what they're doing here. They just got told to do it by somebody, or they think it works for them, and it doesn't actually deliver the kind of consistency that we're looking for in these systems. I've just proven it for so long with so many different rifles over more than a decade of time that you guys have been watching me here on YouTube. It's like every time I unveil a new rifle, I am showing crazy levels of performance with the thing. The insertion velocity of these primers and the grip that the components have after I've inserted them is critical to maintaining this balance. So you have one chance and one chance only. If you try to put the primer deeper after that, these components are locked together, and the only thing that you're going to be actually doing is squishing the base of the primer. You're going to be mashing the bottom of the cup. And of course, it will read a deeper measurement after you're done, but the only thing you're doing is introducing a non-uniformity into your primer. That non-uniformity will come in relation to not only the depth, the distance from your ignition system in the rifle, but you've now non-uniformly deformed the pellet relationship with the anvil and the cup. And so the material inside there isn't going to react the same way because you're putting a lot more force on it now that the primer is already inserted and stopped than we put on it to begin with when we inserted the primer with a nice, deliberate, quick movement. So we want that primer to go in there quickly and come to an abrupt stop. Now that's where the horsepower of the CPS, the design of the competition primer seeder, that's where it comes in. We can achieve a uniformity of priming here that is unrivaled from any other priming tool out there because of this hard stop within the tool. We can move the handle fast and feel what's going on to feel if something's completely out of whack, detect when we have loose primer pockets that will potentially create a safety issue, but then when we actually bang into that hard stop effectively, we will have a uniform insertion of these primers and a uniform deformation, meaning the primer, the pellet inside, the anvil, all of these components are going to have the same experience each time from one to the next. Now, if we've done this correctly and we've set up our priming depth correctly, then we're also going to bring the primer dimensions into uniformity. So we have some primers that have a little bit taller, a little bit shorter height. So there's a variance of the height. Then we have an anvil protrusion variance, and the difference in the height could be caused almost entirely by different anvil protrusion. But we know that that's not so because there's a variance in the cup height also. And these things can be measured with some certainty using primeware. So that means even if we're priming perfectly, we still need to get adequate compression of all of these things to bring them into dimensional uniformity. That means if we were to measure them after we insert them, that means we can bring them to the exact same height. Despite the fact that there's a variance between the anvil and the cup, we can force them to become the same height because we're taking the variance out when we compress our anvils. Now, that's just the terminology that people use. Compress the anvil, anvil compression. And in actuality, we're compressing everything else. We're shoving the anvil deeper into these primers. So if we set our seating depth up to overcome the variance, we not only get a controlled distance, a perfectly uniform distance from the back of the primer cup to the ignition system in the rifle, we also get a controlled distance from the primer pellet, the actual explosive in the primer, to the powder column, the static powder column in the cartridge. So by uniforming these distances is how we get such amazing velocity spreads and such amazing downrange performance when using the Primal Rights priming ecosystem, comprising of the competition primer seeder, the primeware, and this methodology that I have developed to make sure that your ignition problems are a thing of the past. And you pair that up with an action that has been timed and tuned properly by Taylor at Stratton Custom Rifles, and you can start shooting the smallest groups that you've ever shot. You can start shooting the smallest targets farther away than you've ever engaged them before. Now, granted, everything else in your ecosystem has to be right in order to do this. But if you're not currently managing your priming the way that I've described here, then you're not going to really have any chance of getting any better performance, even when you're doing everything else right, but not doing your priming ecosystem correctly. I really want you guys to understand all the little nuanced areas that I just discussed in this primer to brass relationship here. So I've modeled a 22 PRC primal here, and we're just going to take a look at this thing in detail. So let's take a real close look at what's going on in here. Now, the primer cup, as you can see here, is this kind of teal color. The pellet is this grain. This cross-section of like purplish color here is the anvil. And then we've got our brass out here, obviously. So our primer pocket has little radiuses in the corner, like I mentioned, and I've tried to model everything as closely as I could. Now, a lot of this cannot really be modeled very effectively because of the way that these components are made, but you get the general idea here. So the primer is sitting in here and it's dead flush right now. So it's not beneath flush, the very bottom of the case here. It is perfectly flat with that. And as you can see, if we zoom in here, the anvil is not making contact with this at all. So the bottom of the pocket, or in this case, the top of the pocket, the orientation that things are, there's space between here. So if we hit this thing with a firing pin here, it's going to shove all of this forward. There's space for it to. Now, this is not a recipe for consistent ignition at all. In order to have that, we need this anvil to be touching. So if we grab that anvil and shove it up against the top surface there, as long as we have this, now we have consistent ignition. And you can see now we've created space down here. And so this primer is beneath flush now. And that's a very common situation. I'm going to be moved the primer in. You can see this area right here where and I left this way so we could see the interference. Now, I don't have the modeling capability to make this deform, and if I did, this wouldn't be on the outside of the brass. It would be pushed in here, and there would be pressure aiming right in here. So the pressure would be coming from out here and being forced against the anvil over here. So the more we push this up in here, the more that radius is going to push that primer cup into the anvil, and it's going to be squeezing it. So just remember that we talked about that a moment ago. Now, once this primer is touching the top here like this, it doesn't matter how much more we push the rest of this primer in, that anvil is not moving. It's not going to push into that at all. There might be a little bit of flex, and the feet would the prongs on the anvil would kind of move out this way toward the outer perimeter. But as I said a moment ago, it's getting pushed on by the primer cup, so that's not actually going to happen. So as I push this primer up into here more, you can see how this is going to compress that anvil some more. And so the compound in here, the priming pellet, is pretty much going to stay there, and it's just going to get squeezed right in between here. The more we push it up in there, the more it's going to get squeezed. And if we take this to an extreme, it can fracture this pellet. So if we looked at the pellet from the top side here, and we just get rid of the cup, and we get rid of the anvil, and we get rid of the brass, and we just look at this thing from the top side, and let's see the whole thing here. We'll get rid of our analysis portion. If we squeeze this thing too much, it can fracture all along here. So it can just break this pellet and crack it like you'd crack a pill or something, okay? So we don't want that to be happening. Get our cross-section back here. We want to compress everything here, but not so much that it cracks that pellet. As we approach full crush, which is, somewhere in that neighborhood there, as we approach that full crush, we can run the risk of cracking these pellets. Now, certain brands of primers are more susceptible to that than others, but long story short, we don't want that. This shows you the relationship to what's going on here. As we get that cup squeezed up in here, this radius or any of the features in the bottom of the pocket are going to squeeze on the outer perimeter here, and that is good. That keeps the primer from backing out. So we want that load on the anvil, and it'll keep everything tight in there. Now, if you get rid of the other parts here, you can also see that there's a heavy chamfer on the ID of these primer cups. And that chamfer exists specifically because of the pinching that I was describing a moment ago. So as this gets pinched, this will just kind of get mashed inward like that, and it won't be putting too much pressure on the anvil, but it is certainly going to be applying pressure right along here, where the anvil is touching the cup walls on the inner diameter. It's kind of a complicated little series of arrangements in here, and for some of you that may be tough to visualize, so hopefully this helped take the mystery out of it. Now, the final element of this is to perform a primer seating depth test. Now, this is what we use that bottom number on our chart for. This is the window. On the numbers above, we already know how much anvil protrusion we're dealing with, and what I've done is add a couple of thousandths to that, and that establishes the window of testing. So for this particular batch, I would have 13 thousandths of available compression from contact, so not reliable ignition, but from where the primer contacted the bottom of the pocket until I hit full cup contact plus 2 thousandths of cup crush. So at this point, we're talking about complete anvil crush. So the anvil is getting shoved all the way into the primer cup at this point. And that's the window that I would test in a live fire shooting test. I'll grab 3 pieces of brass and I'll seat 3 primers in them until contact. Now, this is 1.5 thousandths based on our calculations here beneath flush. And that's where the shortest primer in the deepest pocket would touch. Now, some primers that are in shorter pockets or taller primers, they're actually going to get some anvil crush here at this setting. And that's okay, because I'm just trying to find what my rifle likes. This is just like doing a bullet seating depth test, except we're using much smaller numbers here. We're not moving 10 or 5 thousandths at a time. We're only going 13 thousandths here maximum from contact, and I'm going in 1 thousandth increments. So I'm going to seat these 3 primers in these 3 pieces of brass at minus 1.5 thousandths. Then I'm going to, and maybe I would pick 2 thousandths just to make it easy. So 2 thousandths beneath flush. Then I'm going to seat 3 more at 3 thousandths beneath flush, 3 more at 4 thousandths beneath flush, and I'm going to keep doing that until I get to 13 thousandths beneath flush. So I'm going from anvil contact to cup contact in the bottom of this pocket. I'm going to go shoot this test, and very much like a bullet seating depth test, I'm going to see some things happening on the target. I'll see a sine wave representation of the round's impact in relation to the point of aim. I'll also see the group size and shape, just like I would in a traditional load development session. So the group size, being big or small, the shape of the group, meaning do I have vertical stringing or horizontal stringing, I'm going to take all of that into account, just like I do on all of the rest of my load development testing. During this test, the rifle is going to reveal to me exactly where it prefers these primers to be positioned. So it's a timing thing. Now, you don't want to go doing a primer seating depth test first. You don't want to do it second. So you want to do bullet seating depth and charge weight, both a rough and a fine test. Primer seating depth comes last. So we'll do a charge weight test first, then we'll do a bullet seating depth test. Then we'll do a refined version of both of those to confirm our findings. Then we will do a primer seating depth test, the way that I just described. Folks, after doing this, you will have the most uniform ignition that is actually a tune ignition that you will ever find for your batch of components that you're currently shooting. Now, just like every other aspect of load development, if you change lot numbers of any of your components, that means your bullets, your primers, your brass, or your powder, well then it can change the timing of everything that we have going on here. So anytime you change lot numbers of components, it's worth revisiting all of your load development efforts, both your bullet seating, your charge weight, as well as your primer seating depth that you've established. Now, there's quite a lot of other variables going on here. I can talk about primer seating depth and its eccentricities for like hours and hours and days upon days. But this is the core fundamental stuff that you need to get your mind wrapped around. You need to understand how these mating surfaces are interacting with each other and how to use these tools properly to achieve your best results. And the expanded understanding of what's going on between all of these surfaces and the dimensions that we're working with here, well, that's just going to make you that much better at wrangling this variable in your own ecosystems. But suffice it to say, once you've taken this in hand properly and you're a studious hand loader that's taking care of all the other issues in your ecosystem as well, you'll start to realize how important this priming thing has been all along. And if you haven't been doing it, you're really denying yourself the absolute best performance that you can get. I realize this video is long overdue, folks. Those of you that are in the mentorship program, I've been counseling you on this for many years now. And then those of you that have come here for in-person training on hand loading, this is something that I've told those guys all along. And I just felt it was time to finally put out a video talking about some of the important elements. Now, there's quite a lot more that's going on here, but most of the important elements that would let you get this priming thing under control in your guys' reloading process. So I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have, make sure you click the like button down below. If you're not subscribed already, you might think about doing that, and then turn on the little notification bell icon down there too. That way you get notified when I put out videos in the future. And if you have anything interesting to say, feel free to comment down below. Now, since this video is all about timing, I think it only appropriate that we talk a little bit about God's timing. So let's take a look at some scripture that shows us just what God thinks about this whole time thing. Let's jump right into the scripture. Here in Ecclesiastes 3, and this is, we'll start in verse 1 here. For everything there's a season, a time for every activity under heaven. There's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. There's a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. There's a time to throw stones and time to gather stones, a time to embrace, a time to avoid embracing. There's a time to find and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away. Another verse, Romans 8:28, and we know that God causes everything to work together for good of those who love Him and being called according to His purpose. Proverbs 16, verse 9, in his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord directs his steps. Now, the Bible is absolutely full of different verses that deal with time. And the moral of all of them is you don't really control anything to do with time. And we can make plans and we can decide that we're going to do these things and try our very best to do them, but there is but one that decides whether it's going to happen or not, and that is God Himself. So don't go getting worried about how much time you have, or this deadline that's approaching, or something that's in the future that you're planning, or something in the past that seems to be haunting you. Because God has a way of dealing with time, and if we'd like to have Him help us with the management of time, all we have to do is give way to Him. We need to start living our lives based on His time, what He wants to do, and we just need to go along with it. And this doesn't mean that we don't be studious and try our very best to get things done. That's just the pursuit of our purpose. If we are pursuing our purpose, then God will be doing things to make sure that our purpose is successful, because that comes from Him, and we are acknowledging Him in every step that we make. So it's not possible, you see, for me to be late with something that I'm working on, and I can't be early either, because it's His time that gives me the authority. It's His time that I'm living on and working on. And there's so many pieces of Scripture that deal with this that I'd encourage you to dive in there and start doing some research on the subject. Use whatever search engine you may and just start figuring out where all of these verses are in the Bible that deal with time. It might make you feel a lot better about your whole situation. Now, this doesn't matter if you're living a completely happy and fulfilled life, which I don't really know too many people like that. There's always something that we feel like is out of place, it seems like. But the timing element of this is very important to recognize is not in our hands. So sometimes we'll be in a season of plenty, other times we'll be in a season of lack, but we will always have what we need. And sometimes those seasons, we need them. Just about every time, when we get through those seasons, we realize what the purpose for them was. And even if we don't, if we're going to be a proper follower of Jesus Christ, we don't have any place to question it. It is not our role to try to decide why we had a thing happen to us or how we got through it, because we know that the only one responsible for getting us through it was God. Our willingness to go along with Him is what saw us through. You need to keep your mind oriented towards your cooperation with God, towards learning more about what Jesus Christ would have you do with your time here, about listening to the still small voice given to you by the Holy Spirit that dwells within you, and cooperating fully with it. If you spend your time doing that, then your days will be filled with much less worry than they currently are. And so many of you that are watching the clock so heavily, most people that I encounter these days, they've got a watch on them. And the reason why is because they always have to check the time. There's always something going on. And now the watches have the capability of being smart watches. So we can not only get interrupted by our phone, we can get interrupted by the watch on our wrist. I think it would be a good thing for many of you to start treating time with the reverence that God says that we should treat it, and maybe just not let it be the source of such worry and stress in our lives as it often is for many of you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. As always, I would like to encourage you to pick up a Bible and read some Scripture. Listening to me talk about Scripture here is wonderful, and I thank you all for it. But there's no substitute for getting the Word directly from the source yourself. Your willingness to obey and read the Scripture yourself, it's just the cooperation that He wants out of you in order to take a more active role in your life. Your small demonstration to Him in that way will oftentimes be the breaking point that would allow you to free yourself from this worldly way of thinking. So give Him the chance to work in your life the way He has in my life and so many others' lives. Just start reading the scripture and you'll start feeling him move closer to you. I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.